All right, so welcome to our panel. The International Committee of the DSA has organized this as a political education panel, and we wanted people to know what's going on basically as far as the US-Iran relations go, and how foreign policy is informed in this space, what the stakes are, and what role we can play in avoiding the worst outcomes that our expert panelists are going to be laying out throughout this panel. And I'm Amir. I recently joined the International Committee, and this is my first act in this body. And the experts that we invited are really brilliant at what they do and in their respective capacities and fields. And I think they would be the best people to let us know, like, everything that, frankly, we're not getting from our news media that would otherwise be lost on us if we're not the most tuned in, well-versed Iran observers that think about this every waking moment. Because, of course, we can't know every single thing that's going on in the world at all times, but this is really important. It impacts millions of lives in Iran, of course. And if, God forbid, a war broke out, it could impact lots of American lives as well. Hence the title, Iran, the Battle in Washington, the Next Forever, the battle in Washington to avert the next forever war. So the first thing that I wanted to cover, because as I said, not everyone in the audience is paying attention to Iran as much, is what the JCPOA or the Iran deal is, the who, what, where, and when of it, so that we better understand how we got here and why this point we're at is so important. So whoever wants to start, go for it. Just a basic primer on the JCPOA. And yeah.
I'm happy to start if Matthew wants me to go first.
Yeah, you'd be able to explain better.
So, I mean, if we were just to break it down very basically, like Amir pointed out, like, just the skeleton or outline of how did we get here and really what is the JCPOA. So the JCPOA stands for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It's otherwise called the Iran Nuclear Deal. It was an agreement reached by Iran and the P5+1, which includes the United States. It was, and so in terms of negotiations, the reason why the deal has two major reasons why it's a landmark agreement, why it's called a historic agreement. The first is its non-proliferation gains. And what that means is, we have this idea of nuclear expansion, fears of more states becoming nuclear. We have 9 countries currently in the world who have nuclear weapons. And this particular agreement, according to non-proliferation experts, which I'm not, I'm using the word of non-proliferation experts, is that it's unprecedented in the level of international monitoring that it entails over Iran's nuclear program. It created strict limitations to Iran's nuclear program, such as the percentage that they could enrich uranium to, as well as how much uranium they could stockpile. And the idea is, right, when you hear nuclear, oftentimes people think of weapons, but in reality, nuclear technology and nuclear science has other applications, energy, medicine, just to name a couple. And so the fear, at least the fear that comes out of, say, the United States or the West, is this idea of Iran weaponizing its nuclear program. So what the deal did is create those limitations and those monitors in order to prevent Iran from being able to acquire a nuclear weapon. Now, when I say that, and it's not based on the assumption that Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon. And the reason I say that is because Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to the NPT. It's often cited because if you are a signatory to the NPT, you are allowed to have a civilian nuclear program, but not to weaponize. And essentially, you agree not to weaponize. So, and we'll get into this more as we discuss, but the reason I'm pointing this out now is because as you hear in recent news, this idea of, Iran has enough enriched uranium to build a weapon. Iran can do this. Iran has reached breakout time. These are ways of sort of building up fear of an Iranian nuclear weapon, but they always leave out 2 key factors. One is that Iran would have to make the political decision. It would have to decide that it wants to weaponize, which has not been said or done yet. And the second is that having enough nuclear material for a weapon does not make a weapon. That process in and of itself would take 1 to 2 years. So let's just keep that in mind as we're moving forward the conversation. Now, the second part of the JCPOA, which was, historic, was the fact that the two major parties within it were the United States and Iran, two countries who had had an adversarial relationship since 1979. And so it really was a show of how diplomacy works. Iran didn't just do this out of its own, good nature. It did it because it agreed to this based on what was promised to Iran, which was sanctions relief, economic relief for sanctions that were hurting Iran's economy and hurting the civilian population. So those are the core takeaways from why the JCPOA was so important. They're two very separate concepts. One, the non-proliferation benefits, and two, the diplomatic benefits. The idea that we don't actually always have to use military strength, militarism, and war to resolve every issue that exists in the world. And in fact, though that militarism has been shown, especially in recent decades, to undermine US national security interests, global security interests, and actually exacerbate the problems that we supposedly set out to fix. So I'll leave it at that. In terms of what it is. Did you want me to go through the timeline more?
No, that was a great primer to start us off. And you touched on breakout time, because that's obviously something that we see weaponized in the news a lot to, I guess, instill fear and mislead the public, the mostly Western public, on what's going on with this deal right now, and or the lack of it. And clearly a lot of people are confused as to what that means, because as you were just saying, it takes 1 to 2 years if the political decision to pursue a nuclear weapon is even taken, which, as far as anyone has seen, as far as US intelligence community is publicly conveyed, there hasn't been any indication of this. So Matt, would you want to go into the ways that this is framed in intentionally misleading ways, especially around the issue of breakout time and how little people are understanding what that means and what it entails for Iran?
Sure. Actually, may I go into some historical background of why this agreement was needed and why we're talking about the stakes of war? Right. So, when people, I even in this conversation, I think this conversation is doing a better job than most, but most, media and public consciousness of the Iran issue in the US is this mess of acronyms and jargon. I mean, sanctions law and nuclear proliferation they're up there with rocket science as very obscure topics. But you can break the stakes of this, which is sad because the stakes of this are war, which is not a niche topic. It's a very real topic. To break this issue down, basically Iran, nuclear weapons are not a very hard technology to develop. The US did it with 1940s technology. The Soviet Union did it with 1940s technology. North Korea did it with a famine. And Iran is a, medium-sized, large, actually about more than half the size of Russia, population-wise, industrial country with an educated internet age middle class. And so Iran has, and not only that, but in the 70s, when Iran was a US ally, the US actually helped them get a nuclear program started, supposedly for peaceful nuclear energy, but people who worked on it, back under the previous Iranian government have said that the idea was to have the option not to build nuclear weapons, have the option to build nuclear weapons. And I think this is an important point to make because this is something that keeps coming back. So in the 90s, the Iranians, so nuclear weapons are not a very hard technology to master, but to actually build a weapon is a very time-consuming and lengthy process. You've got to, I'm not a non-proliferation expert either, but my understanding is you've got to put uranium in these big centrifuges and spin them around for a really long time. It's expensive, time-consuming, easy to notice. Late 90s, foreign intelligence agencies allege that Iran is secretly trying to weaponize its nuclear program. And at that point, whatever weaponization was going on gets shut down. And this is, you know, the US intelligence assessment time and time again, that Iran has not been trying to weaponize past 2003. But now there's this idea that Iran has the capability of building a nuclear weapon. And this is when the US kind of stakes out the same position it's had for the last 20 years, basically says it will not tolerate a nuclear Iran and all options are on the table. Translated to like normal people speak, that means if Iran continues to do nuclear research that we don't like, we're going to bomb it. Not if Iran, you know, builds a nuclear weapon, but if Iran gets the capability to build a nuclear weapon. And when we talk about breakout time, that's basically if based on what their current uranium stockpile is now, how much more spinning around in centrifuges they would have to do to get enough material for a bomb. And as Assal said, having enough material for a bomb is not a bomb. So like there's two decisions that have to be made. One is to enrich enough uranium for a bomb. The second is to put that together into a bomb. And this issue really, I mean, there was a lot of back and forth and speculation about trying to bomb Iran during the Bush administration. There's a really great piece by Ronan Bergman in the New York Times called The Secret History of the Push to Strike Iran. He also wrote an excellent book, Rise and Kill First, which touches on that in some of the later chapters. Basically what happened in the early Obama era is that Iran kind of mastered the nuclear fuel cycle, was enriching a lot more, and was enriching on its own. They weren't relying on outside suppliers. And so then the Israelis started to, well, not just the Israelis, all of Iran's regional rivals, UAE, Emirates, Israel, some other Arab states started to really make a lot of noise to the US. Like, you need to do something about this. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, bomb them. And the Israelis in particular were threatening to do it themselves, which with the implication that, you know, if Israel starts a war with Iran, this is going to drag the US in because it's a regional crisis. And so that's why the Obama administration brokered the JCPOA. The idea was, let's cut some bargain with Iran. In this case, well, no, the idea was, let's placate these countries by pressuring Iran through economic sanctions, which we can get into later. And then at the same time, we'll offer to the Iranians, like, all right, let's kind of solve both these issues at once. You know, let's lift the economic sanctions in exchange for you guys restricting your nuclear program in a way that makes your neighbors comfortable, basically. And also, you know, the rest of the international community comfortable that you're not going to build, confident that you're not going to weaponize. And then I think Assal can explain this because I've been talking for a lot, but a lot of these regional powers were not happy with it. The Republican Party was not happy with this agreement. And now the Trump administration basically reversed that policy, which has been continued by the Biden administration.
I could follow up. Yeah. So there's a couple things that Matthew said that were important. One was this idea of the Obama administration placating, say, Israel and Saudi Arabia. Those were two of the states that the Obama administration attempted to placate. Now, how did they do that? An unprecedented military aid package to Israel, amounting in $38 billion, and basically a green light to Saudi Arabia to do whatever it wanted in Yemen, which includes war crimes. So, and why I point those out is because it speaks to a larger perspective, a broader perspective that goes outside of just the JCPOA. Why, for instance, when you talk about Republicans who are against it, why is it that in the US, it is so easy to sort of have these anti-Iran attitudes and anti-Iran stance, even when the policy is accepted by basically the entire international community minus a handful of states, which is, by the way, something that the US constantly espouses, right? The values of a rules-based order, the idea of an international community. But somehow these principles, these values, human rights, rules-based orders, international law, they're always selective, right? It's a selective way of looking at it. So why is Iran having a nuclear program specifically so important when, for instance, Israel has nuclear weapons? Israel not only has a nuclear weapons program, it has a nuclear arsenal. It's not acknowledged. The US doesn't acknowledge it. Everyone knows they have it. It's a secret that everybody knows. And yet there is no, there's no similar international response to Israel having it. Now, what is the response from the US? Well, Iran is a rogue state, Israel is a democracy. Only if we don't count apartheid, only if we don't count crimes against humanity, only if we don't count war crimes, all of which Israel's actions constitute according to basically every respected international human rights organization on the planet, right? But how do we end up in these constant cycles? Because there's this overall sort of vilification and demonization of Iran and Iranians that has become commonplace in American political discourse. And if we're talking about the history, a lot of that gets rooted back to the hostage crisis of 1979, in November of 1979, when Iranian students seized the US embassy. Now, I know that we don't have that much time to get into all of the history here, but that particular incident, one of the historical context clues that most Americans are missing is that one of the reasons, and I'm not saying that it justifies it, right? This is not a justification, but an understanding of the logic that brought about that event was a fear that the United States would repeat the coup of 1953. That is why the embassy was seized 2 weeks after the Shah of Iran was allowed into the US for medical treatment. So why is all this history important to know? It's important to understand where there are mutual grievances between states and how we can move forward from those mutual grievances in order to have, if not friendly relations, peaceful relations, because that's to the benefit of everybody, right? That's the entire notion of something that's beneficial. That's why we have an international community, by the way. Like, the whole reason we have an international community, we created the UN, by we, I mean human beings, was in the wake of world wars, right? I think like the first sentence of the UN Charter is about averting the scourge of war. So that's why central to these arguments is, how do we have peaceful relations with other countries? And a lot of times from the Iranian perspective, there is a certain amount of hypocrisy that comes from the Western side, especially from the US side, because they can just look right at one of their neighbors in the region and say, but they have weapons, they do these things, why is it specifically on us? Now, within all of that, keep in mind, Iran still agreed to this. Iran still complied with this agreement. And, don't take my word for it. That's what the IAEA reported multiple times. In fact, the Trump administration, the very administration that reneged on the deal, that quit the deal and removed the United States from the deal, reimposed sanctions that violated the deal, they did this in May of 2018, right? So Trump becomes president January of 2017. He constantly talks about the fact that he hates the deal. But at the time, we have Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. And so the Trump administration certifies the JCPOA, it certifies this deal. What does that mean? That means they're saying that Iran is complying with the deal. So we know that Iran is in compliance with the deal. Come 2018, I think it was around April of 2018, Secretary of State changes, becomes Mike Pompeo. And within a week or two, the US quits the deal. So you have people who are making foreign policy decisions, someone like former Secretary of State Pompeo, who actually said he believes it's possible that Donald Trump was raised by God to defend Israel from Iran. This is the type of political rhetoric that we have coming out of the highest echelons of US political discourse. And it really blurs the line of church and state that we so proudly talk about in this country. So you have this history and you have this sort of adversarial thing. And the reason I bring it up is because it's very easy when you just listen to the media and popular culture in the US to assume that, well, the reason we have this problem with Iran is this villainous state. And the reason we don't have this problem with these other countries is because they're all really good. That's not the reality on the ground. And the reason why we often have policies that are misinformed is because we have a public that is totally misinformed. Last year, Brookings Institute had a survey that showed that more Americans falsely believe that Iran possesses nuclear weapons than believe that Israel possesses nuclear weapons when it in fact does. And that is not something you can blame the public for. That's the institutions that are informing them. That's the politicians who are talking. That's the news media. That's where their understanding is coming from. So I think a lot of times in these types of discussions, we have to sort of differentiate between the reality on the ground and just like start to scratch the surface of what the problem is.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that Mike Pompeo quote, because it really illustrates the hypocrisy, as you were saying, of, well, the US paints Iran as this rogue nation with apocalyptic views. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State, an evangelical Zionist, is going on about how, as you said, Trump is raised by God to, go on this crusade against Iran on behalf of Israel. And, the irony is lost on a lot of people, but for those of us that are following this, it's really screaming in our faces. And I also put this chart up. I actually took this from Assal's Twitter. And I mean, this makes it as simple as it can be. If the concern on the US side, which, I mean, the only concern on the US side was the nuclear nonproliferation and wanting to keep Iran far from even breakout time, which, as you guys explained, breakout time doesn't even mean you have a nuke the next day. But yeah, the chart clearly illustrates that enrichment was up, the Iran deal brought it down, it went on, plateaued for a while. And even after Trump unilaterally pulled out of the deal that all the other major powers were still signatories of, Iran still waited before they started refining again. I think roughly a year is that about the time they took. But yeah, I mean, they gave the US enough time. And then, of course, when Biden came in, the assumption on a lot of people's minds was, well, this was a campaign promise of his to reseal this deal and save it. But he didn't do it on day one. He didn't do it in week one or the first month. It's been over a year into his administration and still hasn't happened. And they, during their scramble in the first months, they didn't even actually plan any more meetings in Vienna to discuss this or negotiate this. So we got a lot of unnecessary delays. And right now, there's a few issues that are, I guess, presented as obstacles to resealing it. And I wanted to go over a couple of those. One of them is the FTO designation of the Irgc.
Well, may I add something before we get into that?
Yes.
Yes, on the point of hypocrisy and just, the fact that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal and all this. I mean, a lot of American DC think tank types will talk about deterrence and realism and how we have to, our enemies only understand strength. But what is the lesson to the Iranians from all of this? They cut a deal with the US that was mutually beneficial and was, a big concession on their part, right? You open up your you open up your domestic nuclear program to international inspections, in exchange for something that the US sometimes has to force on other countries of we're going to open our markets to you. And, the reward for that is that the American political system became far more radicalized against Iran. After about 2 years of the deal or less of the deal being implemented, it gets pretty much, torn up, and Iran is under more pressure than it ever was before. It actually faces military attacks and very serious signaling from the US that they're going to do a regime change attempt. And then, I guess the thinking near the end of Trump was okay, that was a weird US domestic politics hang up and this is going to get back on track. And then you see under Biden, regardless of whether Biden is sincere in his desire to get back to the deal or not, he's so, and we'll get into the details of this later, he's so hamstrung by elements of the American political system that he can't even promise Iran a return to the 2018 status quo. So what's the lesson of that is that if you give concessions, the other side is going to just use them to screw you, excuse the French, and that hardball is the only way to play. I mean, so that's, and amidst all of this, right, they're doing this while they're facing, Iran says a lot of extremely unhinged things towards Israel that are very threatening and they probably shouldn't say. Israel, which actually has nuclear weapons, is saying stuff like, you are an existential threat to us and we're going to cut the head off the octopus. Naftali Bennett recently said that, something about Iran is the head of the octopus, we got to strike at it. That's a very threatening thing to hear from your neighbors. So, it's amidst all of this, it's a miracle that the Iranians want to negotiate, right? It's a miracle that they're willing to after getting the football yanked out from under them, like Charlie Brown, over and over again, that they're willing to say, okay, well, there is some benefit in maybe the West will actually, and particularly the United States will actually good faith, like negotiate something mutually beneficial.
Thank you for adding that, Matt. So I was going to go into, I guess we're still on the first part of the agenda about the JCPOA itself and the current obstacles, because we got a good primer of the general history of it. And I mean, this took years to negotiate the initial deal too. So even that, we can't stress enough how much of a significant historic feat that was between two countries with such an adversarial nature, but that was possible. What is making it less possible now, or what's been making them drag their feet this time around? Because they already had the building blocks of a deal. They have to negotiate the terms of re-entry, of course, but what's stopping them at the moment, in the opinion of our experts?
Do you want to go, or could I? Yeah, I mean, it's been reported that the big hangup is the sorry about the acronyms, but the foreign terrorist designation for the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The long and short of it, in 2019, the Trump administration declared part of the Iranian military a terrorist group. And this had never been done before, because US counterterrorism law is designed to prevent, like an American company from doing business with like ISIS or something. But now this is being applied to the army it's being applied to the branch of a government. It would be like declaring the Marine Corps a terrorist group. And so as in practice, that just became a super sanction. Terrorism sanctions most US sanctions have exemptions for food and medicine. Terrorism sanctions don't. So the US can declare the Central Bank of Iran a terrorist bank because it's attached to a terrorist government, or the government that's attached to a terrorist army. And suddenly there's no exemption for, medicine transactions into Iran during the COVID pandemic. They declared the steel industry and oil industry of Iran to be like terrorist industries because they supply or finance the Iranian military. They even declared a university a terrorist university. And yes, I think a big difference between the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the Marine Corps is that it's a lot more embedded in the Iranian economy. So it's not just like declaring the US government a terrorist organization, it's like declaring the US government and also Jeff Bezos a terrorist organization. Maybe that's not a perfect analogy, don't quote me on that. And I think the most stark thing they've done with this is they've actually seized Iranian oil tankers from other countries, recently from Greece, with the idea that it's terrorist oil and we can just take it because it's outlaw oil, basically. The Iranians, like, understandably, and again, this is something that had never been done before, was first done in 2019. The Iranians have demanded that be lifted as part of a general lifting of economic sanctions, because again, the bargain here is that the US of the JCPOA is that the US lift economic sanctions and allow Iran access to global markets if Iran is to restrict its nuclear program. So, if we're going to return to the 2018 status quo with that, you kind of have to remove these turbo sanctions that are letting you nab oil tankers that the Biden administration is continuing to use to nab oil tankers. But, the Biden administration has insisted that, no, this is actually a separate issue from the deal. Terrorism is not part of the nuclear sanctions. And in large part, this is because some members of Congress, as well as the Israeli government, have really pushed the Biden administration to not lift that. We can get into which members of Congress these are and how this fits into a broader opposition strategy later, but that's the hang up. Basically, the US political system does not want to return to the pre-2019, not pre-Trump, pre-2019 status quo with terrorism sanctions. And so it is refusing to do this. And so the Iranians are basically saying this is our red line. There is some reporting that the Iranians are willing to kind of trade that for a concession somewhere else, but we'll see where that goes. And the Americans have basically said this is not even on the table about the JCPOA. This is a totally non-nuclear related issue.
So, I mean, everything that Matthew said, I think, clarified certain points. That does seem to be the most recent hangup, if that makes sense. But ultimately, the hangup in why the Biden administration, why Biden, and then we say administration, but it's Biden who ultimately makes these choices, is not or has not returned to the deal, is because they've chosen not to. That's all it is. They've chosen not to do it. And this goes back to my earlier point, which was about this sort of like demonization of Iran, because, you know, it's politically costly domestically for an American president to Matthew's point, to delist the Irgc from the terrorist list. It's politically difficult for a president in the US to basically do anything that creates like reconciliation with Iran, because Iran is supposed to be bad, evil, and that's it. That's just the only way that we sort of, in terms of the way that it's framed in the media, that we read the situation. But it's a question of political will. Now, what's interesting about that is after the election, a poll soon following the election showed that a bipartisan majority, that means Trump voters and Biden voters, supported negotiations to resolve the nuclear issue with Iran. So we hear all about bipartisan this, bipartisan that. Here you go. Here's an opportunity to do something that both sides want. There are other polls that have consistently showed that the broad American public, the majority of the American public, supports the deal of 2015. There is broad sort of dissatisfaction with US militarism and endless wars. This is why both Biden promised to end endless wars and Trump promised to end endless wars. Republican, Democrat. Why? Because that is what the American public wants. So then why aren't we doing it? That comes down to, again, like the sort of DC politics and the people that they have to deal with. Who is, you know, in the administration's ear saying, no, don't do this? Well, one, for instance, is the state of Israel. In fact, Matthew talked about a report that said that the Biden administration is not going to, has decided not to delist the FTO designation of the Irgc. Guess who he said that to? Prime Minister of Israel, right? So it's the influence that we're seeing doesn't actually make sense given the public consensus and what they want to see. What they do not want to see is another costly, fruitless war in the Middle East, especially at a time when the war in Ukraine is impacting. Just look at, you know, inflation in the US, energy prices, food prices. We're looking at a global food crisis. They may last for years. The idea that we would even entertain escalating conflict with Iran in that context is basically insane. I don't want to use any other word because there's no other word that would properly describe it. That is not a prudent political policy position. That is fanaticism. To be that fanatically, we can't do that because it's going to look bad, but we'll risk the possibility of a much, much worse situation for our own people, not only for the Iranian people, not only for the global community, but for our own people, is really an irrational position to take. So the FTO designation is something interesting. You had Secretary of State Blinken, I think just a month ago, saying that it's symbolic. He's like, well, it's a symbolic designation because in fact, the Irgc is already sanctioned multiple times over. When the JCPOA happened, it didn't mean that all US sanctions were lifted, right? There were many US sanctions still in place. And that's why the Biden administration has said that sanctions that are inconsistent with the JCPOA would have to be lifted. What the Trump administration did, and did intentionally, did by design, okay? And this is from the mouths of the people who were proponents of these policies. They intentionally double and triple sanction certain entities in Iran so that they would be designated under nuclear sanctions as well as terrorist sanctions. What does that mean? That means if Biden comes and lifts nuclear sanctions, they're still sanctioned under a different category. That's why the FTO designation was put on the Irgc. And if you want to know how arbitrary that FTO list is, think about the fact that the Trump administration also designated the Houthis under the FTO. And guess what Biden did? He delisted them. So it's the choice. These are political choices that this administration is making that are frankly extraordinarily short-sighted. And the reason is because we're so focused on, and as we should be, domestic issues in the US, but in terms of foreign policy, the Biden admin has sort of just switched on, we're just going to focus on Ukraine and Russia. And that is extremely problematic because it's ignoring what is a crisis that is boiling, that once it is created will be much more difficult to put back. But ultimately, this administration chose not to return to the JCPOA. Keep that in mind. The US is still outside of the deal. The US never returned to it. So the only party that ever quit the deal and is not currently a party to it is the US. Biden could have, with a stroke of a pen, returned to it. He didn't. The Biden administration criticized basically all of Trump's Iran policy, lambasted it for years, and has essentially maintained the same policy, the same designations, essentially the same sanctions, and is not a party to the deal. So, it raises the question of sort of why, and the answer to that we can continue to explore.
Yeah, I want to add a few points if there's time. To the first point Assal made, I mean, yeah, it's really interesting kind of how the public opinion doesn't really get that much of a, it doesn't really have that much of an impact on the debate. This is totally an elite level debate. Because if you ask members of the public, there are polls where they ask members of the public, basically, they describe exactly what the 2015 deal is. Like, would you support a deal to, open Iran's access to global oil markets in exchange for them restricting their nuclear program? People are like, yeah, I like that idea. But that's not how it's covered. The way it's covered is either this like weird mix of acronyms and nuclear terminology and saying just, specialist talk, or it's like Obama gave Khamenei $20 bazillion in a barrel to like kill babies with. This is, so it's not really, it kind of comes into public consciousness when there's an actual, sometimes it comes in events like crises, push it into public consciousness, but there's no real public debate about the big picture of US strategy. A second point I want to make was, Assal said, the report that Biden has decided not to lift the terrorism designation was through the Israelis. I think that by itself was an Israeli tactic. There was, anonymous reporting that the Biden administration was, had decided not to do it. And there were, I think, some public statements to the effect of like, we're not going to discuss these non-nuclear issues. But the Israelis were the ones who I think Naftali Bennett was the one who publicly came out under his own name on the record and said, Biden told me he's not going to do this. And not only that, but he came out a month after the supposed conversation happened. So I think part of this was, I don't know, this is not me speaking from sources or anything, this is speculation, but I strongly suspect that there were some internal discussions in the Biden administration about this FTO decision, and the Israelis decided we want to make sure that they don't reverse course. So we're going to make it a big public dog and pony show. So they're kind of stuck in this position. The third point I want to make, thank you, Assal, for bringing up Russia and Ukraine. A lot of Americans, I think both pro-war and anti-war, really don't conceive of what a war with Iran would be like. I think a lot of people's frame of reference is like the Iraq War or the post-Iraq interventions, which were even more kind of, from a distance or light touch. But this would be like nothing Americans have experienced since at least Vietnam, even before. This would be closer to the Russia-Ukraine war. What happens when like a state smashes into another state, both of them having modern armies. Iran is a country of 80 million people. It's half the size of Russia. It's an industrial state. I think this is like several times larger. I don't know exactly the number, but several times larger than Iraq or Afghanistan were. Iraq was an industrialized country, but Afghanistan was not. There's no ongoing civil war the US is intervening in. This would just be like a war against another country. Not only that, US generals have, I think it was Mark Milley, again, don't quote me on that, head of the Middle East and Central Asia Command, CENTCOM, who said Iran has missile overmatch. They have enough ballistic missiles to overwhelm US and allied air defenses. So, so for example, Brett McGurk, the Biden administration's kind of Middle East point man, has publicly said, we don't think a regime change war is feasible, but a limited war to shut down a country's nuclear weapons program, that's feasible. But there's like no real way this would stay a limited war. I mean, if if the US bombs an Iranian nuclear facility, which itself is a casualty producing event, right? The Iranians are going to be shooting back. This is not Top Gun. This is, this would require large amounts of aircraft. There would be accidents. There would be, they would be taking fire from Iranian air defenses. And then Iran retaliates by, let's say, shooting missiles at Dubai or Israel or an American ship. And now CNN has images of casualties. American investors in the Gulf are screaming. American investors in Israel are screaming. There's calls for vengeance. Plus, it probably heats up in Iraq and Syria, and the US has to flood more troops into those two countries just to protect the troops that are already there. Do you see any US president being like, okay, it's even, we got in our punch, you got in our punch, like, fine, like, whatever, call a shot? No, it becomes at the very least, something a lot like post-1991 situation with Iraq, where it's this protracted containment campaign. And yeah, I just think that's like, that stake really needs to be driven home to people. Like, this is not some like foolish thing where the US can do a lot of damage and then, pay some long-term costs, but ultimately doesn't affect life inside America. This is like Russia-Ukraine scale global economic disruption and, taking Russia-Ukraine type casualties.
And I'll just add to what Matthew just said. That's on top of Russia and Ukraine already, right? Like we look at energy prices right now. If you're American, you go to pump some gas. You've noticed a lot of people complaining because prices have risen extraordinarily. The Strait of Hormuz is in the Persian Gulf. And if, to Matthew's point, if we actually do reach a stage where we're in some kind of a conflict, Iran can exact pain, not on the US, but on the entire global energy market, which would affect everybody, by impeding shipments of oil that go through that very small strait in the Persian Gulf. Something like 20% of the world's oil, I think, flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So imagine where we are right now and magnify it by quite a bit. And this is why the idea that, and this isn't like, we're not fear mongering here. This is, you've heard former Trump administration officials talking about Plan B, right? Israel simulated a military attack on Iran just a couple of weeks ago. Yesterday, Reuters reported that Israel is pushing the US to helm military buildup against Iran. This is not hearsay. This is not like we're trying to make it bigger. This is what is being said and done, and the reasoning behind it. And so this is why it's quite different than Iraq, because that is one of the parallels, right? The concept of their weapons of mass destruction, we're going to preemptively strike to prevent. I mean, this is the same playbook. We've heard this before. The fact that the countries basically have the same name besides one letter makes it almost parody, right? But we've seen this occur. The differences are many. If we thought, if Iraq would pale in comparison compared to Iran, at this stage, right? Iran of right now is a country that has built its sort of network of power within the region. And this is an important point to make, because of US interventions, right? US interventions in the region have actually helped Iran. So here's this constant policy that constantly backfires, And then the irony is it's the only policy apparently we have any idea how to implement. Iran, in terms of population, it has a larger population than Afghanistan and Iraq combined. It has a larger landmass. It has a massive bureaucracy. It has multiple branches of security forces. You're not, the idea that this is the path we would go down is ludicrous for so many different reasons. But the worst part is that we have the alternative. We already have it. We already know it works. We know that we can resolve this conflict. We know that we can avert war because we've already done it once. We know that Iran complied and we know that it worked. And the fact that we have a clear, viable alternative and it's not being taken is, I don't even know what to call it. It's almost criminal in its sheer stupidity to say we're not going to do it because, if you think there's domestic pressure now, there's political pressure now. Imagine the scenarios that Matthew and I have, and nobody can predict what will happen, right? These conflicts are totally unpredictable. But you can make educated guesses based on the precedent that we've seen. And the precedent that we have seen is these conflicts and our militarism has exacerbated these problems over and over and over again. And this is, if nothing, worse.
Thank you for that, guys. Matt brought up the Iraq War, and of course, most people in this viewing right now and most DSA rank and file members know about the sheer brutality of the war on terror, the millions displaced or killed. And of course, there's enough incentive to want to prevent that from escalating further and on such a grander scale as you guys were outlining. But even before the Iraq War, as Matt was pointing out, there was that protracted containment period where following the Gulf War, they were under severe sanctions. And even that was causing lots of pain, death, and suffering on the Iraqi citizenry. So that's a good segue to the human costs of the current sanctions on Iran. And Assal, I think, has written a lot about this. So I think she would have a lot to say, but they're like issues of overcompliance, access to medical goods, just some of the main ways that these sanctions strain the most vulnerable and marginalized demographics within Iran, and don't even touch the people that are supposedly these adversarial villains that we hear about in the news.
Well, in terms of the impact of sanctions, the first thing is, I wish I had the graph right now to show you, but there's a graph that was pulled from information from the International Monetary Fund, and it shows the inflation rates in Iran over the last decade. And basically, you have a lot of inflation during the Obama era sanctions. And I remember then, that inflation compared to what they're experiencing now is not even comparable. But even then, it caused a lot of strain for the middle class, for the working class, for poorer people in the country. And then you have the JCPOA, which you see inflation sort of go down, and then you see rescinding the JCPOA and the reimposition of sanctions, and it shoots up again. So the information is unquestionable, right? There is a direct link between sanctions and the overall economic health of the system. Now, none of that is to say that the Iranian government is not itself extraordinarily problematic, that it's not corrupt, that it doesn't affect or exacerbate those problems quite a bit. It does. And that's why when you see Iranians protesting in recent weeks, because they're protesting basically the fact that they can no longer afford food, who they hold responsible is their own government, as most people in most countries do. You hold your own government responsible for things. That doesn't mean they don't understand, right? It doesn't mean that they don't understand that there's two factors contributing to this idea. But of course, people tend to hold their own officials responsible for whatever the situation is. Just like right now in the US, the Biden administration can keep saying things like Putin's price hike, but guess who they're holding responsible? Biden. They're holding Biden, the administration, the government officials. That's who they're holding responsible every time they're pissed off. So you see the same types of phenomenon. Just the fact that you have, when you have hyperinflation, that means the money you had is suddenly worth, a tenth, a 50th, a 100th of what it was. And that means your buying power shoots down. So even when you have certain commodities that are available in the market. Mind you, we're going to talk about the part where certain things are no longer available in the market, but even when they are, you can't afford them because they're too expensive, right? So there's food, but when food is too expensive for you to buy, it's not really that exciting that the food is there. So there's that. There's also the part where, for instance, in specialized medicines have seen a hit because of sanctions, where, for instance, like cancer patients who are in need of chemo medicines don't have access to those medicines. There are other specialized diseases that, specific countries have the medicines for, and because of sanctions, because every bank is afraid to run afoul of US sanctions, they simply don't participate in these transactions. And so you'll hear the line constantly from the US side, which says, well, humanitarian goods are exempt. And this is true, but that's on paper. The reality on the ground is, despite those legal exemptions, in reality, the flow of those goods are being impeded. This was said, and I've said this repeatedly in a lot of places because you cannot emphasize this enough. This was said by Joe Biden in April of 2020, when he was criticizing the Trump administration at the beginning of the pandemic. Remember, Iran was one of the first countries hard hit by the pandemic, in a statement saying that, yes, humanitarian goods are exempt, but the nature of US sanctions is impeding the flow of essential goods in a pandemic. And he called on the administration at that time to take steps to immediately, on humanitarian grounds, because it was a pandemic, because it was the right thing to do. And of course, the right thing to do is the American way. It's literally what the statement says. Then the Trump administration should immediately take steps to address it. Now, this is what the Trump administration did. They doubled down. They increased sanctions throughout the pandemic. This is what the Biden administration did when they came in. Nothing. So you have all of this rhetoric when you have one side, when you have this sort of like domestic politics in the country. But the reality of it is, we know that sanctions are impacting people in that country, ordinary civilians in that country. We know it's affecting their ability to buy food. We know that if it's pushed millions of Iranians in the middle class into poverty. We know that it's affecting their ability to combat a pandemic that is ongoing. And we simply do nothing about it. And to be clear, Iran is not the only case in which this is happening. US sanctions, these broad-based blanket sanctions that affect the entire economic sector of a country, hurt civilians. That's who they hurt. And we know that this is happening. We have known that this is happening. For decades, we have known that this is happening. And if you want to know just a tidbit of how our officials feel about that, recall a conversation with Madeleine Albright in the 1990s when she was asked, is it worth it to kill 500,000 Iraqi children with sanctions? And her response was, we think it is. So this has been a decades-long policy where we know that sanctions have this type of impact on the civilian populations, and we continue to not only use them, but expand their use.
Yeah, I just want to add something about the way, kind of a meta point about the way sanctions are covered. Because Assal can speak to and has spoken much better than I can about the internal Iranian situation. But in the US discourse, if they talk about sanctions, it's often like, okay, well, is this specific thing sanctioned? Like medicine is not sanctioned, like Iran can buy medicine. And then, there's this whole, sometimes there are cases when the exemptions don't work and you can't actually buy medicine because sometimes it's like the banking and insurance and shipping are sanctioned, so can't actually ship the goods or pay for them. But just zooming out on a broad scale, like any kind of, whether or not, this specific sanction has, it's like hard to say that this specific sanction is this effect and then this specific sanction is government mismanagement, because if you're just like smashing a country's macroeconomic performance with a hammer, well, of course it's going to have all these weird systemic effects, and of course it's just going to make life worse across the board. That's the whole point. It'd be like, just picture for a moment that China used its control, all the US debt it held to just wreck the US economy, to just, I'm not an economist, I don't know how they could do this, but just make the US dollar worth half of what it was before. Your bank account is worth half of what it was before. Inflation is out of control. And at the same time, they're massing troops outside the US and talking about regime change. Of course, that's going to make people miserable and cause all kinds of effects. And, they might, someone in China might say, well, such and such effect was actually from federal government's response to it. But, this is while you're seeing a barrel that's being smashed with a hammer. It's rattling everyone inside. Another thing about the way sanctions are covered, it's this whole idea, like I said earlier, that Obama is personally handing cash to Khamenei that Khamenei can buy a gun with personally. A lot of this, it's an intentionally simplistic understanding of how economics work. A lot of the issues around sanctions are with Iran's bank reserves, basically. Basically, Iran gets paid for its oil, but it got paid in US dollars in a foreign bank account. And so the US Treasury can basically block them from can freeze those dollars and prevent them from actually using their own money. And of course, that causes all kinds of problems with the value of the currency and paying for imports and paying for imports if your money's jammed up there. But the way it gets covered is oh, the US is going to freeze $100 million, as if when the US is going to freeze $100 million or whatever in oil revenues, which, is going to go into a central bank of Iran account and help stabilize the currency and pay for imports. The way that gets covered is America is literally throwing $100 bills out of a plane over the Beitul Rahbar. It's just, yeah. So Beit Rahbar is the Iranian leader's residence. So yeah, that's a big part of it. And again, imagine if China just froze the US Treasury out of its own bank accounts and then said, oh, but you can Chinese charities will hand out food and medicine in America, so it's all good. I mean, that's basically the equivalent of this discourse.
I think what Matthew said is so important because it speaks to the framing, and the framing is intentional, right? That idea, this image that literally it's as if the American government is taking money from Americans and handing it over personally in bags to Khamenei in Iran. And the reality of it is they're releasing Iranian money. It's money that belongs to Iran. The same way that there were banks in the US that had money that has money that belongs to Afghanistan. And what do we do there? We also froze their access to their own money. Not only did the Biden administration freeze access to their own money, they actually decided to take some of it to give to 9/11 families or to save it because there are legal proceedings. And these are the legal arguments that are used, right? There's always a legal argument. It's well, legally there's a proceeding in the US or legally there's a case in the US that finds Iran culpable for 9/11, which it had nothing to do with. And therefore, because Iran has no representation, obviously in a court in the United States, by default, it always goes to whoever is suing and they owe billions of dollars for that. Legally, there's an argument for why the US can take an Iranian tanker and sell its oil for the US. There's a word for that. It's piracy. So these ideas are based on the fact that the US is the only implementer of law. It's not international law, it's US law. But at what point, you have to be able to differentiate. Do we even have international law then? I mean, if the US can impose whatever laws it wants, wherever it wants, in any waters, anywhere in the world, that's no longer international law. That's imperialism is what it is. But this is just commonplace. It's commonly accepted. We've internalized the idea of empire to such an extent that for so many people, they don't even understand. They don't even think about it. It's oh yeah, we took an Iranian shipper. Yeah, an Iranian tanker. It's but that doesn't belong to the US. It was off the coast of the UAE, right? It was in the Persian Gulf. I mean, you have headlines that say things like the US Coast Guard does defensive moves in the Persian Gulf. And I always put a map out when I see that headline where it shows the Persian Gulf and the US coast. And the idea that the US Coast Guard is on the other side of the world and somehow it still has that jurisdiction to essentially do whatever it wants, is the root of what is problematic about most of these discussions. And until we learn to really embrace the notion of internationalism, really take part in international law rather than placing ourselves above it, the sort of rhetoric that we use always rings hollow.
On that point of the U.S. Coast Guard defending the Persian Gulf, there's a great essay by, very short, but I think pithy essay by this political science professor, Mark Lynch, about the Abraham Accords, where he talks about, what is this thing that just happened? Like, how can we explain it theoretically? I think 2 years on. And he basically says, it makes the most sense if you think of it as like the UAE and Israel as key nodes in the American capitalist global system. The UAE is heavily invested in American real estate and entertainment and tech. Israel is also really heavily invested in tech and defense. And so, to just extend his idea, it is, it might not be, these places might not be part of the United States, but the reason why the US does these seemingly irrational things is because they basically, I think we can get into it with the next point, opposition to diplomacy, but the US has basically taken on like these countries' elites as part of their own elite, or has taken on these countries as integral nodes in like the American system. And so it is, from the perspective of, like, Joe Schmo from Idaho, the Emirates is another country, but from the perspective of someone in Washington, it's actually, a core part of the American global empire.
To them, it's basically their investment portfolio that they're talking about. It's not something that far off. That's a great pivot to opposition to this diplomacy and covering, I guess, the international side of it, what foreign governments are involved in anti-JCPOA advocacy, and just like where the rhetoric is coming from domestically and where it's coming from abroad. And there's obviously a lot of institutions all in the DC Beltway to cover, whether it's the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, as ironic as that name can sound to people familiar with them, or NUFTI. But Matt, I think, has done a lot of research on this. So by all means, take it away, Matt, and paint us an image of the general Iran hawk landscape in Washington and why this is an uphill battle for people that are either anti-imperialist or just restraint-oriented liberals and social democrats in Washington, D.C. that want the same deal because of the reasons that you've laid out.
Sure. So I think Iran hawkery, as Assal alluded to, a lot of it goes back to 1979. And I think you also have to look at the war on terror, where Iran was at once kind of a piece of unfinished business, right? It's the one like Islamist nation state in the world, or to depending on your definition. And also, the Iranians, as Assal alluded to, like really outmaneuvered the US in Iraq. And so I think there's a lot of people in the American security elite, members of Congress, military and other former officials, think tankers who really see this country as like unfinished business and they want to finish it off. But a large part of this Iran hawkery, the engine of it is Iran's rivals in the region, as we've alluded to. Mostly Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Emirates. People always forget the Emirates. Like, they talk about the Saudis, but the Emirates are in some ways more aggressive in lobbying. And then, some other countries like Bahrain, who are part of this regional structure, really, pushing the US. Sometimes it's directly through threatening to attack Iran or exhorting US diplomats. And sometimes, a lot of these like domestic Iran hawk groups, some of them sometimes there's a lot of sharing of talking points and information, and sometimes money between foreign actors and domestic pressure groups. Now you have both like paid foreign lobbyists, like registered, like I am a PR company working for the Saudi government, or lobby groups that are, American donors funding these pro-Saudi, Emirati, or Israeli lobby groups. But then you also have think tanks, which is a kind of more informal type of influence buying. Just to explain, put some context out there, a think tank is basically like a quasi-academic institution, nonprofit that has a specific angle. So let's say you want the US to build more trains. You start the Institute for Transportation Studies. You hire a bunch of pro-train academics to put out pro-train white papers about, how this will raise $3 gazillion in tax revenue if we build more trains. These people will speak to Congress. These people will get cited in the media. They'll get slots in congressional hearings. They'll get to speak to Congress, and every so often, an administration that's sympathetic to trains comes along and hires one of these people as in the Department of Transportation. Same thing happens in foreign policy, and so you have a lot of think tanks that are very hawkish on Iran. Sometimes, and they'll get money from foreign governments, and then their experts will go on to testify to Congress or work for the U.S. government. In the landscape, I mean, you have your generic, hawkish conservative think tanks like Heritage Foundation, AEI. You also have your generic, pro-Israel ones like Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Sometimes you call it YNUP or Washington Institute. It's a spinoff of AIPAC. It's like an academic thing that puts out papers, but was created, by the same people who made AIPAC. Or, the United Arab Emirates funds the Middle East Institute and the Arab Gulf States Institute. And these put out a lot of papers, and sometimes their experts get, media spots or cited in Congress. The two think tanks that are most Iran focused, and I think are the most interesting to look at, are Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It's kind of an ironic name. We'll get into that. And United Against Nuclear Iran. Now, again, if you're like a formal lobbyist, there's a lot of things you have to disclose, especially if you're lobbying for a foreign government, like legally. But if you're a nonprofit, you're just like an academic institution, a research institution. You don't really have to disclose your funders. However, there are ways through either bureaucratic slip-ups or looking at other people's tax filings, because if you have a nonprofit that donates to another nonprofit, you have to list that. And my former colleague, Eli Clifton at the Quincy Institute, did a really good job of piecing this together through these kind of little bureaucratic things and figuring out who funds FDD and United Against Nuclear Iran. Biggest funder of FDD is Bernie Marcus. He is the owner of the Home Depot. Really outspoken, Republican, general foreign policy hawk. He's gone on the record and said Iran is the devil. Like literally, Iran is the devil. Second biggest funder was a guy, Paul something. Hold up, I have it written down here. Yes, Paul Singer. I don't know too much about him. He was like a big Republican, funded a lot of like anti-Trump Republican and LGBT Republican stuff. And then the third biggest for FDD is Sheldon Adelson, who's probably the most interesting character here. He is a casino magnate. Well, the late Sheldon Adelson, may he rest in peace, because his wife Miriam now runs the donation stuff. She's Israeli, he's not. They fund, they're big Trump mega donors, just general Republican donors. Sheldon Adelson actually went out and said that that someone should like blow up a nuclear weapon in the Iranian desert as a show of force, like really hawkish guy. And he also funds a lot of other generally hawkish, Middle East focused, think tank and lobbying institutions. The other one, United Against Nuclear Iran, is a little bit stranger. I can send the link to Eli Clifton's piece on this. They are a group. Oh, and also FDD, in terms of what influence they have, just to make clear of like how think tanks have influence. They frequently have their experts testify to Congress. they wrote a lot of op-eds and stuff that were kind of seen as like putting out the Trump administration's position. And an FDD staffer, Rich Goldberg, became John Bolton's Iran point man. And FDD was continuing to pay his salary as he was serving as a White House staffer. Also, in terms of FDD funding, Adam Milstein, or the Milstein Foundation, which is also kind of behind Canary Mission, if you guys know what that is, gave money to FDD, just to paint a little picture of the context. And also, the FDD insists that it does not take foreign contributions, but there was a little bit of a scandal in 2017. Basically, there was this guy who got arrested or got charged with a lot of illegal foreign agent stuff, like acting as an unregistered agent of a lot of different foreign actors, or I think two. Anyways, one of the things this guy did was act as a middleman to funnel UAE money to FDD. When this came out and FDD was asked about it, they said, we don't take money from foreign actors, but they didn't say whether they gave the money back. United Against Nuclear Iran, they do a lot of like amateur intelligence work where they like track companies that do business with Iran and publicize them to try to dissuade them. They track oil tankers to basically as like a volunteer intelligence thing to like help the US Treasury find them. And they also, put out a lot of policy papers and such advocating for a harder line on Iran. Now, there was a lawsuit. This Greek businessman got listed on their thing as someone who does business with Iran, and he contested this and sued them for defamation because he's like, yeah, you guys are defaming me in court. And one of the things his lawyers asked for in discovery was who funds UANI. The US Department of Justice then stepped in and said that's a sensitive national security secret. Really weird. However, Eli, God bless him, he's a great journalist, pieced together who funds UANI. Most of the money comes from Adelson, who we mentioned before as an FDD funder. Another big part of it comes from this guy, something Kaplan, who's like a really interesting figure. He's a mining executive who's written a bunch of prospectuses for investors talking about how his businesses would be poised to benefit from instability and conflict. Very on the nose. And just one more thing about FDD. Bernie Marcus, who is a big FDD funder, also funds US-Israel police exchanges. And he's come out and said, like, basically, this is a good thing because Israel and the US they're facing the same kinds of threats. Again, just like this is a very like Republican, hawkish, war on terror throwback worldview. Sorry if that information was all out of order. I was just, it's a lot of stuff and I was trying to present it in a way that was coherent.
Thank you so much for that. That really, that was like a speed run through Washington where you really laid out the entire cast of cursed characters that should be on everyone's radar here. But thank you for that. The next item on the agenda.
Wait, can I just add one thing?
Oh, so I'm so sorry. Yes.
No, please. Because I mean, I'm not adding anything to what Matthew said, because I think that presentation was phenomenal and obviously speaks to so many of the sort of behind the scenes types of policymaking that takes place. The only thing I wanted to add is basically everything you just listened to Matthew describe is an entirely undemocratic process. That's it. Like if you're an average American listening to that presentation, there's no way to take it except for the fact that that's why, if you go back to a little while ago when we were talking, everything Matthew described is why, even though a majority of Americans have particular political views or policy views, whether it be foreign or domestic, and why for some reason in our, deeply flawed democracy, that doesn't translate into actual policy positions is because of that system of basically like money and lobbying, which is how DC is actually run versus what it's supposed to be, right? That whole a government for, by, and of the people. It's supposed to be listening to actual constituents who are the people who elect officials. But that's unfortunately not the process that we see. And that's why when Americans have a view, that view does not become policy.
Oh, I may add one more piece of information. Sorry. A few years ago, when Qatar and the UAE had a dispute, I mean, these were two US, it's ironic because it's two US partners having a dispute, but got very nasty. And a bunch of emails from a from the UAE's ambassador in Washington got just like hacked and dumped. The Intercept did really great coverage of it. I don't know, we don't like, it's not known who hacked them, but it seems pretty obvious it had something to do with the Emirati-Qatari dispute. But a lot of Iran-related stuff came out in the emails. One of them was that, you know, FDD and the Emirati ambassador were like swapping info. Another one is the Emirati, that this, you know, foreign terrorism designation for the Iranian military was something that the Emirati ambassador was like directly going around and asking for. So it's not just as if like, you know, the kind of first Obama term where these countries make a lot of noise and then the US feels pressured to do something to preempt them starting a war. There's also like direct policy asks and direct connections between what these countries are asking for and what gets done, like specific policy elements. And I think, did you want to get into like the specific members of Congress and stuff and how they lined up on this?
We're running a little low on time, but like a speed run through them, yeah, that would work. I mean, on the Democrat side, the biggest name, of course, the chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, Bob Menendez, Senator of New Jersey. On the Republican side, it's basically all of them, I think, with the exception of Rand Paul.
Yeah, okay, so exactly. So there's, you know, again, nobody comes out. I shouldn't say nobody. It's very rare. Sometimes you have figures come out, whether on the American side or like the you know, Iran's enemies in the Middle East side, and say we want war. People don't public, they know that's a toxic thing to say. So a lot of this is just opposing, saying you want a better deal, which is what Menendez's line is, or I think Mark Dubowitz, who heads FDD, has said that he wants a kind of Cold War style struggle that will lead to the fall of the Iranian regime. Actually, funny enough, there was a recent Iran hearing in Congress, and the two experts that got invited were like Karim Sajjadpour, who is a Carnegie Endowment liberal guy who says the US should wage Cold War until the Iranian regime falls. And then Mark Dubowitz, a conservative guy who says the US should wage war until the Iranian regime falls. Cold War. So, but, you know, you'll hear different answers of what people actually want, but in practice, it just comes down to pushing Congress to like hamstring whatever the latest diplomatic initiative is by, you know, for example, the foreign terrorism designation thing, right? You had a kind of bipartisan members of Congress come out and say, don't lift that. They're not going to come out and say, we don't want a nuclear deal with Iran. Menendez, in theory, wants a deal. He's just like, I don't want a deal that includes that. Yeah, so Menendez in the Senate, Josh Gottheimer in the House. I really have lovely members of Congress. Josh Gottheimer in the House is one of the big Iran hawks on the Democratic side. And then on the Republican side, it's like you said, everyone but Rand Paul. And may I add, like a lot of these kind of Greenwaldian national conservative types will say we're against forever wars, and they'll be really bold when talking about forever wars that happened 20 years ago, or when talking about Russia, Ukraine, where US policy is pretty much set, it's not going to change. But on Iran policy, where it's a very high stakes thing that could actually lead to a war and could be averted, the Republican Party is pretty unanimously, if not for war and defending things like blowing up General Soleimani, is against, pretty consistently coming out against any kind of diplomatic initiative. And someone like Matt Gaetz will have come out against a war with Iran in theory, but then when it comes to like the Iran deal, he comes out against it, and he's certainly not going to say, well, the US shouldn't bomb Iran either way over nuclear weapons. So sorry about that rant. It got into a bit of a tangent.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we are nearing the 7:30 end time, and I wanted to fit in the Q&A, but just before that, there was an item on the agenda, what can we do? I put my mind to it, and I could not think outside of electoralism. So best I could think of is call banking members of Congress that have been openly critical about the deal or against. And we have a sheet prepared actually for, I sent it in the chat, which has the script, has a list of certain members to call the offices of. Of course, we can't do that now because their offices close 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But if you can and you have the time, I definitely suggest you call them and implore them to make this happen sooner than later, because as our experts have laid out, the stakes are extremely high, and like there can't be any more feet dragging on this. This was a Biden campaign promise. This isn't the most radical ask in the world. This is what Obama achieved as one of, if not like of the few achievements of the Obama administration. So we're just, as Matt said, going back to 2018 status quo. It's not the biggest ask, not the most radical, but clearly there's a lot of obstacles that we went over that's making this as difficult as it has been. That being said, if you guys have any better suggestions for the what can we do part of the agenda, I'm open to hear, but I'm also going to be pulling up the Q&A questions from the audience.
Amir, I think you sent the link to hosts and panels to everyone.
Sorry about that.
But yeah, I don't have any suggestions. I'm not a I have, I'm a journalist and I'm going to lay out how I see it happen. It's up to you guys what you want to do with that information. But it does. I will just add that in large part, it's not a domestic political issue that the public has a big say on, but it could easily become one.
Yeah, I mean, Amir, I think what you're suggesting is really what we can do. Having these conversations, I think challenging the narrative is a really important concept to me, which is what I try to do, because certain things become so commonplace for us that we don't question it anymore, and we should, because the people who will suffer if it goes down a path that we obviously want to avert, to Matthew's point, even the people who enact policies that lead to war say they're against war. So it seems like it's pretty broadly accepted that a war would be a bad idea. But in order to get there, we really need some kind of energy behind, it's like we wait till there is a disaster before we do anything. And I know there's sort of just overall fatigue in this country, mostly because of what's happening domestically. It's because the US is the wealthiest country in the world, we forget how much of that wealth is hoarded at the top. And the fact that there are actually Americans, millions of Americans who are struggling, who are homeless, who live in poverty, who experience all these things. And it's hard to say, hey, focus on this thing. But the reality of it is this thing can make everything much, much worse. So it is something important for us to try and get in a better policy path.
In the Q&As, there's one for Matthew. If Matt can talk about what bombing Iran's nuclear facilities could mean for civilians and humanitarian wise, because they said the euphemism of a limited strike obviously conceals a lot of the horrors that would entail. So yeah, would you go into that a little, Matt?
So I'm not a military expert or a expert on like the safe disposal of nuclear material. So I wouldn't, but I can say, okay, the model that a lot of hawkish figures use often is the Israeli strike on the Iraqi nuclear reactor in the 1980s. Ironically, this was done when Israel and Iran were kind of co-belligerents against Iraq, and the reactor had been provided by the French. To Saddam Hussein, how much times have changed. But like the Iranian nuclear program is a lot different from that. It's a lot of these reactors are buried very deep in the mountains, or they're, in big cities. They're scattered all over the country. I mean, this would require a massive sustained bombing campaign. And to do that, you'd probably also have to take out Iranian air defenses. Like, this wouldn't just be like again, it's not Top Gun. It's not some action hero flies in and then flies out. This is like a large air campaign that produces lots of casualties. Yeah, I wish I could say more about whether the actual like hitting a nuclear reactor or a nuclear enrichment facility, like what kind of environmental damage it does and whether that poisons people. But unfortunately, I'm not a nuclear scientist.
All right. Well, another question, either of you could take this one. If what's holding up a deal is the dispute over delisting the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization, a designation which the administration says is mostly symbolic, why does Biden think a mostly symbolic designation is worth sacrificing the nuclear deal and risking a situation that would likely result in a lot of Americans getting killed? How does that make any sense strategically or politically?
It doesn't. I don't know how else to say it. It's so frustrating because when you phrase it that way, it sounds so ridiculous. But we have to accept the fact that sometimes our policies don't make sense. They don't make sense in terms, here's the way of looking at it. It doesn't make sense if your concern is, US, like the American populace at large, global security, civilian populations in targeted countries, human rights, international law. If any of those things are your concern, then it makes no sense. It does make sense if in fact none of those things are your concern, that you just use these political talking points because they sound great, because that's what the majority of human beings think, right? But in reality, there's two things that I would add why they go in the other direction. One is ideological. Like Amir talked about this earlier, this idea that we always think about other countries or adversarial parties as being fanatic or being ideological. They hate us because of our freedom. We always have these kinds of ideas about everybody else, and yet we have absolutely fanatic policies. The fact that aid to Israel is unconditional, military aid to Israel is unconditional. Just using the word unconditional is fanatic. What does that mean? That means anything they do, they can violate every human right on the planet. Doesn't matter, still gonna give them money. So that is a fanatic stance. So part of it is ideological. Part of it, I gave an example of the Secretary of State of the United States saying that it is possible that Trump was risen by God. Right? These are things that are being said. You cannot deny that ideological part of it. But the other part of it is the logistics of the system that Matthew was talking about. Why they still, you still see this sort of machine that continues these policies that are, by every objective mean, the way that I described, irrational, is because it pays their way to do it, right? A small group of people do benefit from it. And so that's why they do it. They benefit, right? When we talk about Afghanistan was a massive failure. Yeah, it's a failure if you care about human beings. It's not a failure if some people want to line their pockets with a bunch of money. So it's a question of when we behave in these sort of, as the question stated, like strategically and politically nonsensical ways, that to my mind is what differentiates the decisions that we make.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's a kind of U.S. military industrial complex. A lot of it's concentrated in the Middle East. And then there's also, other industries like tech and finance that are getting concentrated, particularly in the Gulf, that have kind of globbed together to become this perpetual motion machine. And I think ironically, this machine's ability to sustain itself is causing other problems with like the larger imperial structure. It's sucking a lot of resources that could be used for like serious great power competition in China and Russia. I think it's, people talk about the US going into the Middle East for oil, and securing the free flow of oil was and supposedly continues to be one of the goals of US policy. But in a lot of ways, just started to undermine itself, both by creating instability that threatens the Straits of Hormuz, and also just by taking Iranian oil off the market as a tool of policy. Like, But I think in a smaller picture, like what are the Biden administration politics? I think Biden as a guy tends to take the path of least resistance. And so he's not going to like start a war with Iran by choice, because that requires a lot of speculation. I don't think he's going to start a war with Iran by choice, because that requires a lot of effort and political capital. He's not going to like fight to preserve the JCPOA, because, you know, it's that also requires him to, you know, take effort and capital. So he's just kind of like, let this be the next guy's problem. I think that's kind of the attitude they've taken. If the Iranians want to come back and like make it really easy for us to join the deal, we'll do it, but we're not going to like really push that really hard. I think what it becomes very dangerous is if one of these other, if another country starts a war, and then there is a crisis in the Middle East, and then the path of least resistance becomes like jump in with them, because, you know, CNN is screaming about it, then we might see like go from zero to Biden on TV talking about precision defensive strikes on Tehran or something. That's like the scary scenario. But I think a lot of this is just like the administration taking the path of least resistance. I can go longer than 7:30. I don't know about you guys.
I won't keep you or the audience too long, but I think one more question to tie us back to the title of the panel, you know, the battle in Washington to avert the next forever war, is another question from the audience. Following a briefing by administration officials this morning, Senator Chris Van Hollen told reporters that Biden's plan B for dealing with Iran's nuclear program includes lots of different elements, including a military option, but, quote, would likely result in a lot of Americans getting killed. Now, I mean, like, where would you start with this? And like, if they're coming out and saying this publicly, and like they know the costs, like the Millennium Challenge, Matt could give a little background on that. That would be good. They know exactly the scale of this war and how it, you know, as Matt put it, it would be like nothing the US has ever seen since the Vietnam War. And like these discussions are clearly being had at the highest levels, but we're just not seeing the political will be mustered to do this faster, even though, despite the stakes being what they are. So what are, I guess, closing thoughts would be another way of framing this question. What are your closing thoughts and remarks regarding, the stakes and the risks involved with this deal not going through?
I mean, I've talked a lot about that already. In closing, I did want to say actually an interesting thought that came to mind is like a lot of politicians and security elites will talk about deterrence and, you know, how we need, like the Abraham Accords, where we're actually rallying, you know, Israel and the Gulf states together to balance out Iranian power. But if you look in practice, the US is not, and this goes beyond the Iran issue, the US is not pushing for balance in the Middle East. It's pushing for the opposite, actually. It's pushing for these favored partner states to be able to hit anyone else and for no one else to be able to hit them back. Like that's the opposite of deterrence. And that's the opposite of a stable deterrence situation where anytime anyone makes, you know, any kind of gain where there's a balance of threat, the US will flood in weapons and money and technology to make sure that no, these favored states have the upper hand, which, you know, prevents there from being any kind of deterrence. If mutual deterrence, you know, mutual deterrence means if I hit you, you hit me back. And so nobody hits each other. And the way the US does it is also designed to keep us involved. The stuff we sell to the Gulf states is heavily dependent on American, you know, technicians and mechanics and spare parts and refills. And in terms of Israel, I mean, it's written into law. There's something called Israel's qualitative military edge. Congress has literally mandated, so the US has to sell Israel better military technology than is available to any of its neighbors. And so this basically guarantees that this is a machine that runs on forever. I think the Iran nuclear issue is, the machine has run into a lot of crises, and the crises have become opportunities to basically invest more in military power in the US. But the Iran nuclear issue is finally the one issue where like, this is actually a contradiction too big to handle, and one that could cause serious like global level damage to the US led order.
I guess I would add to that in terms of closing thoughts that the very last sentence that Matthew said, the US-led order. The US-led order is the problem. That's essentially what it is. And the reason I say it's the problem is because, you know, just like Matthew just described, if you want actual stability somewhere, you don't try to game the situation to make sure that certain parties have an edge over other parties. And the reason you don't do that is because that invites resistance from those other parties. So while those who are resisting that kind of power dynamic are painted as crazy and fanatics, it's actually quite prudent, right? It's pragmatic from their point of view, at least, maybe not from our point of view, because our point of view is empire, right? That's why these sort of the constant hypocrisy comes from that very fact. It's rooted in the fact that the US-led order is not the order of internationalism that we've constantly talked about. It's not the order of rules that we talk about. It's not an order that's led by human rights by any stretch of the imagination. And it's very simple to understand that because look at the very states that we are supporting in the region. Who are we giving an advantage to? Democracies? No. They're human rights abusers. They have political prisoners. Countries like Saudi Arabia execute religious minorities. I mean, these are not countries that are, you know, the sort of beacon of hope for the future of a world filled with justice and human rights and all these wonderful kinds of flowery language that we use. So the reason why the US-led order is the problem is because it was never actually incorporated into this idea of internationalism. So what I would say, just to end on, I guess, a semi-positive note, is I don't think that means that there isn't a way forward. I think that we have the idea for the way forward, but that we actually have to, that's why there's a special sort of responsibility on Americans to make sure that our country is the country that could lead that way, right? And maybe this is overly optimistic, but I genuinely believe that possibility exists. It's just a question of whether or not we choose that path. Every empire historically has come to an end. I'm a historian, so that's why I say it, right? There's no such, in terms of human history, the US empire is quite young, right? There are empires that lasted much longer and they're gone now. So, you know, it is a question of what kind of future we see and we want to create, and, you know, staying active and hopeful and believing that we can have these conversations and take actual action in order to hold our politicians at the very least responsible for the, you know, for the values that they talk about, I think is the best path forward.
Really great book, In the Shadows of the American Century by Alfred Mccoy. He talks about how US, you know, this like unprecedented US power over the entire world is going to come to an end in the next, I think in the next decade, he predicts. And he basically lays out like 4 different scenarios from most white-pilled to most black-pilled, from the like lightest to darkest scenario for how this order comes apart. And yeah, the second worst one beyond World War III, he predicts is specifically a war with Iran, just because of ideological stuff and, you know, overinvestment in the Middle East militarily. Just, you know, leads causes the US to get itself into a really, something that not only harms US power, but causes a lot of destruction for human life on the way down. And I think that's again, this is some niche topic, but I think for a lot of people, but it's also one of the most dangerous scenarios for our future.
Thank you so much for that. Just give it a silent round of applause for our great panelists, since they're not on audio, but I'm really happy both of you came on here. I have tremendous respect for both of you, and hopefully the audience gained a lot from your insights. And as we said about what can we do with all the privileges that we have living in the imperial core, we need to move the conversation about this toward a more honest one, for starters, that actually lays out how bad the worst case scenarios can be. And I think you guys did a great job at that. And hopefully we're going to take away all the lessons that we've learned. And again, want to remind the audience and stress it to do the call banking. I know it sometimes doesn't feel the best, but you never know. If they get enough call volume about a certain issue, they'll at least have to make a public statement, and that moves the needle for better or worse. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Have a great night, or depending on the time zone, day, afternoon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this and for everybody who watched, and to Matthew for his great commentary.
Yeah, thank you, Assal, for and Amir and DSA in general for working on this together. This was a very valuable discussion about a pretty bleak topic, but very much needed. And yeah, thank you so much.
Are there any projects that either of you would like to plug that you're currently working on, or?
I don't have, it's not a current project, but it's actually a report that I authored that was released earlier in the year called Othering Iran. And I think obviously it's very related to what we're talking about, but it sort of outlines the history that created this rhetoric that puts us in a position where, you know, we have policies that undermine our own interests. So I would plug that, I guess.
I have a few freelance journalism things coming out, so follow me on Twitter for when they come out. And I suppose, yeah, I will be leaving to Jordan in a few months on a certain fellowship for research. So I should say that the positions in this panel were mine and mine alone, and not those of the United States Department of State or Fulbright program.
All right. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.